Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're just getting set up as usual. Be starting shortly. Where is the... There we are. Just, again, bear with me. I'm getting situated, posting links. All the usual funness. And then I'll be starting. Again, be starting any second. I am technically a minute early, so we're good. So as I promised a couple of weeks back before the Stephen, no, I'm blank, Lancaster, interview, tonight we're going to be discussing cults. Going to talk about what a cult is, going to talk about whether or not that's necessarily a bad thing to be a cult, and then we're going to talk about some of the more infamous cults in recent memory, the Branch Davidians, Shakiro, the Jonestown cult, also known as People's Temple. Look at some of the nasty things they did, what makes them bad, what makes them good, and try and talk a little bit about what gets people interested in cults. So I guess the first thing we really need to do is define the word cult. Looking it up on Merriam-Webster Dictionary's website, it gives 3 different definitions. A small religious group that is not part of a larger or more accepted religion and that has beliefs regarded by many as extreme or dangerous. A situation in which people admire or care about something or someone very much or too much. A small group of devoted supporters or fans. There's a few other definitions on here. Formal religious veneration, worship. A system of religious beliefs and ritual, also its body of inherence. Religion regarded as unorthodox or spurious, also its body of adherence. A system of cure for disease based on dogma set forth by its promulgator, health cults. A great devotion to a person, idea, object, or movement or work, as in a film or book, especially such devotion regarded as a literary or intellectual fad. The object of such devotion, usually a small group of people characterized by such devotion. And if you look it up on other dictionary websites, the definition tends to resemble the definition for religion. And that's the first thing to realize when you're talking about cult. in an academic sense, a cult and a religion are not that clear cut. This is one, this is the other. Quite honestly, it's hard to get any two academics to agree on a definition of religion, let alone and if you can't properly define what a religion is and what a religion isn't, it's hard to factor in, okay, what's a religion and what's a cult, what's the difference between the two. The large question, I mean, some people listening, like I was when I first hit college, are probably thinking, oh, I can define a religion, it's veneration of God or gods. Okay, you think that's simple, it's that simple. What about Eastern religion, like Buddhism, in which you don't, in some forms of Buddhism, you don't actually worship Buddha. You may acknowledge the existence of gods, then you may not, depending on which one it is, but it's entirely possible to be Buddhist without believing in a personal God with that has a personality you can interact with. Some forms of Hinduism see it that way. Some forms of Taoism see it that way. A lot of the Eastern religions lack what you call a personal deity. In a Western religion like Christianity, God is a person. He's bigger and more powerful and more intelligent than all of us, obviously, but he's still someone with recognizable motivations that you can interact with, that has a personality, has awareness. In Eastern religions, the divine is something greater than all of that. It's not something you can interact with in that way, nor do you necessarily attempt to do so. So that doesn't work as a definition of religion, even though, looking it up on Merriam-Webster's, the first definition they give you is a belief in a god or a group of gods. An organized system of beliefs and ceremonies and rules used to worship a god or a group of gods. An interest, a belief or an activity that is very important to a group, person, or a group. Again, Eastern religions don't fit that definition very well. As Melinda pointed out, it depends on the Eastern religion. It also depends on which adherent of the Eastern religion you're talking about. You're absolutely right. Melinda said typically religion is more accepted by the masses, and a cult has unorthodox views deviating from normal belief. By most definitions of cult, at some point, most, if not all, of the major religions fit the definition. The usual idea of it's a veneration of a single leader that has supernatural power. Yeah, that sounds like Jesus Christ. That sounds like Moses. That sounds like a lot of important religious leaders. Forgive me for bringing in food. I haven't eaten today. I've been asleep. So here is the thing. To make this a workable discussion, because again, the reality is being a cult isn't necessarily a bad thing. As Melinda said, and as I've been trying to get at, it usually means that you're part of a group that's seen as weird or different. Terms often used as a way to stigmatize people, and it really shouldn't be, because it really just academically, it usually just means you're different than everybody else. I don't want to go there. Partly because it's disrespectful, partly because you can get into lots of pointless arguments about, is this a cult, is this a religion, how long, if it's if we go by the definition I learned in college, which I generally like, which is that a cult is a religion that is new and significantly different than the societal norm. Well, okay, how long does it have to be around before it switches from cult to religion? There's another definition from the otherwise very good book Kingdom of Cults, which is it's a very good resource on fringe religious movements. It's very heavy-handedly Christian is the one major downside with it. Particularly, it's written with the mindset of, okay, here's how to preach the gospel to these people. If you can get around that, it's factual information about the beliefs of these systems is accurate. It's just dealing with the heavy-handedness. Okay, so to get something useful, I'm gonna go with the definition from Robert Snow's book Destructive Cults. I think it's more useful for this particular discussion because we're not talking about any group that calls it, you know, you want to call Wiccans a cult, okay, we can argue that, but the reality is they're not generally practicing black magic, they're not generally hurting people, they're not generally killing animals. They're not really an issue that we need to be talking about, nor is it my intention to do so. So, cults specifically, for the purposes of this discussion, is a small, tight-knit religious group centered around one or more charismatic leaders believed to have supernatural powers that is provably guilty of criminal activity, particularly in this case, violent criminal activity. So, the vast majority of people who consider themselves Wiccan aren't in this discussion. The handful of teenagers that show up from time to time that sacrifice cats because they think that's what Wicca is, would be a different issue, because no, they're actually doing something illegal and immoral, and for that matter, most mainstream Wiccans, if not all of them, would completely denounce any such activity. Yeah, Sermon has a point in maybe that it's not how big it is or how long it's been around, just how accepted it is. Like when a group has been around so long, you can't imagine the modern world without it. That's not really a cult anymore. You have a point to a degree. Again, I think it's a little arbitrary just in terms of by whose standards. An Eastern religion that's been around for thousands of years, when it's first introduced to the United States, is something pretty radical, new, and different. And it's a point that's made, I think, that's true if you read the book Kingdom of Cults, that, it talks about Islam, Buddhism, and Taoism, and while it absolutely explicitly states, no, these are actually religions, not cults, the way that they often behave is very similar, that individual practitioners behave is very similar to cult, and that can be true. And it's the thing, mainstream religion can act very cultic, much like cult at time. You also run into sects and offshoots. We're talking tonight about Branch Davidians, and we're talking about People's Temple, and these were offshoots of mainstream Christianity, which very few people consider, except people that consider all religion a cult. Not many people consider mainstream Christianity a cult. But again, it's this different little splinter group. So again, I think, specifically, focusing on groups that have done violent criminal activity, makes it more useful, to the discussion, because again, people, and as Melinda points out, Branch Davidians in turn were a branch of the Seventh-day Adventists, which I'm not an expert on them by any means, but by at least some academic discussions of the Seventh-day Adventists I've seen, they started as a cult in terms of the more hierarchical veneration of a leader, and then have since gone into being an accepted denomination that has more mainstream beliefs, which is another example of the fact that these definitions are very loose. There's a whole bunch of questions I've seen raised about the entire Waco incident, particularly in terms of how much the government overreacted, just by virtue of the number of weapons that were actually found on the site versus the number of the type of those weapons that, I've seen that all of the automatic weapons that were found during the raid were in fact owned by the federal agents that were there. Um, they've also that in fact the federal government may have fired first. That's a very long discussion, and definitely outside of what we're talking about tonight. Um, for that matter, there's even some question in terms of how much Koresh claimed to actually be divine. People show, the government showed a lot of clips of him, saying, seemingly comparing himself to Christ. But how much of that was accurate and how much of it was actually quote mining? And, if you take a bunch of clips of a Christian hellfire, fire and brimstone preacher quoting scripture, and you edit it out of context, it now sounds like he's actually saying he's Jesus Christ or some other. If you edit anything someone says dishonestly enough, you can make them say almost anything. But again, you look at, there's a lot of groups in this country and worldwide that people consider cults. Hare Krishnas, which again is an offshoot of Hinduism, although it's been a while since I've read his books, and I don't really intend to focus too much on the Krishnas. There is some evidence of them getting into shady dealings. Buddhism, Wicca, the New Age movement. Most of the Eastern religions, when they come to the United States, get perceived this way. It is certainly true that a lot of groups that are seen as cults tend to venerate their leaders as almost Christ-like figures, or seeing them as reincarnations of Christ himself. You see that you may or may not, depending on who you believe, have seen that with David Koresh. You see that to some extent with Jim Jones. You see that with a lot of these other people that at the very least will, if not claim to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, they often will claim to at least be a prophet, to have special knowledge. And again, not everyone who does that is necessarily doing, Mormonism. Joseph Smith claimed to be a prophet. He claimed to have gotten special insight from the Archangel Moroni. And while previously in 1800s there was a whole bunch of issues with things that they were doing, mostly because the federal government was coming down very hard on them. Mainstream Mormonism today is generally law-abiding, peaceful people. There are groups within Mormonism that are extremists, like there are in any other religious group. Fundamentalist LDS, for example, groups that actually still practice polygamy, but the mainstream church formally denounces the practice of polygamy and has for over 100 years. It was Brigham Young, Joseph Smith's successor, that first denounced polygamy and said this is no longer acceptable. Or was it Joseph Smith himself later? I don't remember. There's some evidence that actually may have been a matter of helping get Utah statehood. Yeah, Fundamental Latter-day Saints, FLDS. Most of the crazy things you hear associated with Mormonism today, the child marriages, the multiple wives, child abuse, sexual abuse in particular, are with groups within the FLDS, not within mainstream Mormonism. Mainstream Mormonism denounces these things as much as everybody else does. I have my issues with Mormonism as a Christian, because their beliefs and my beliefs disagree on several important points. But those are ideological issues, not moral issues. And I'm not here to lecture on whose religious beliefs I think are right and wrong. I'm here to talk about cults that actually are engaged in violent criminal activity. And cults, particularly cults that have black magic or demonic aspect to them. I am going to wind up dipping into Christianity and the Bible, mostly because I feel that the Bible has some particularly useful things to say on the subject. Because it does talk about people like this, talks about people that are claiming to be Christ, it talks about people who claim to know when the end of the world is. It talks about false prophets and false teachers. And given how many of these cults claim to be Christian, and then go against these things that the Bible is very clear on, it's telling, and it's worth remembering when you're confronted by somebody who's claiming to have this special knowledge or this special ability. It's like, well, okay, if you're going to claim to be Christian, and you're going to claim certain things within the Christian paradigm, you need to not contradict what the Bible says about those things. There are specific definitions of what a prophet is. And most of the, some of them are very simple, some of them are esoteric. One of my particular favorites is the Bible actually says that for someone to qualify as a prophet, everything they say, every prediction they make, has to come true. Absolutely 100% of the time. Under Old Testament law, if you claim to be a prophet and you make a single prediction that doesn't come to pass, you're executed or struck dead by God himself. The logic here being that a prophet gets information directly from God. God is infallible, so if the prophet speaking for God makes a mistake, clearly he's not speaking for God. There's a reason in the Old Testament that when the great prophets of the past were called, Elijah, Moses, people like that, the response was, "No, thank you, Lord. You got the wrong guy." It's like, not me. I don't want the responsibility. And you run into these groups, and it's like they make all these wacky predictions, and they say all these things, half of which never come true, and then they have an excuse for why they never come true, and they have a new day. And the reality is, there's a lot of people out there predicting the end of the world that are completely harmless. They're not going to turn around and tell their what's his name? Harold Camping predicted the end of the world at least 3 times. I think, in fact, 4. Maybe even 5. He's the big one that a couple of years ago was saying, "Oh, the world's about to end today." And then he was wrong. And then he predicted it for the next year, and he was wrong again. And he said, "I clearly have no idea what I'm talking about." Yeah, that is an interesting point, Melinda. I didn't even think of it. But that most of the cult leaders are looking for attention never given to them, whereas the prophets of the Bible often fought their position as of a prophet. And that's true. Even Jesus himself, it's like he saw this laid out before him, and he still, prayed the Gethsemane prayer. I would not have this, but if it is your will, or I'm bungling basically, Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his execution that God, the Father, picks up, let him pass on this, not have to die horribly and painfully on the cross, although he accepted it as God's will. And you find that with a lot of the prophets of old. When Mary was called to carry Jesus, she's, "I am God's handmaid, and I will do your will." Joan of Arc, who's a fascinating figure and fairly off topic, but I love Joan of Arc, so I'm going to talk about her briefly. Generally speaking, wasn't necessarily jumping at the idea at first. Most historical people are like, "Wait, you got me? You want me? Are you joking?" It's like, I don't want to question the all-powerful and all-knowing, all-loving God, but are you out of your mind, Lord? Whereas, most cult leaders, it's like they jump to be what they see themselves as. And again, I'm not necessarily arguing that people that want to call themselves a prophet are bad people. There are plenty of people, like Harold Camping, he eventually, after being wrong many, many times, simply admitted, I'm wrong. I don't know when the end is coming. And it's worth saying on that count as well, the Bible explicitly says that not even Jesus Christ knows when the end of the world will be. So any religious leader claiming to know is wrong out of the gate. But with Camping's case, he wasn't encouraging his followers to all go live off in a commune to hide from the U.S. government. He didn't tell anybody to drink cyanide-laced Flavor Aid. Fun fact, and we'll get into it. We'll touch on it again, I should say, when I get into Jonestown. But where everyone thinks it was Kool-Aid, it was actually Flavor Aid, which is basically a generic version of Kool-Aid that was popular at the time. I would agree with Circuit Man. Circuit Man saying this would suggest there's a certain personality type which is looked for when determining who should receive divine wisdom. I'd agree. The most obvious example I would think that is true across the board religiously, not just in Christianity, is most great religious leaders were humble men. When you think of Jesus, he washed the feet of his apostles. When you think of Buddha, he was rich, he was powerful, he had women, he had everything he wanted, and then he decided, screw that, I'm going to go live off in the forest for 40 days to find enlightenment. It's not really, the Dalai Lama is not generally seen as a proud and arrogant figure either. Most religious leaders that are legitimate, in my opinion, show a high degree of humility. Certainly, the prophets of old did, and not just in Christianity. And I'm trying not to turn this into the Christian show, because I want to keep my religious beliefs from influencing my point, because I think if it influences it too much, it takes away from the overall message I'm trying to get across. Also, of course, I obviously don't want to offend the fact I know I have a number of friends, and I have people I know who are listening who aren't Christian. So if I get a little too preachy, I don't think the end result's going to be good. And if I do get preachy, which is probably going to be inevitable, I do apologize. So okay, that's what a cult is, at least for our purposes. Let's start with one of the more obvious types of cult. This is not nearly as common as some people imagine, but they do exist, and they're the group that everybody thinks, for a lot of people, particularly a lot of Christians, first think of when you talk about a cult. We might as well address the elephant in the room, and that would be Satanism. So, as I've said before, as a demonologist, we differentiate three different major types of Satanism. The first type being Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. Is it a cult by most academic standards? Yes. But for the purpose of the show, while it does have a great deal of respect for a single influential leader, it's not engaged in criminal activity. There are a number of well-documented recent instances of the cult turning in its own members when it found out they were going to do things like murder people in the name of the devil. There are extreme and insane members, just like there are in any other group or faith. And while I have my issues with LaVey's philosophy, it's, to paraphrase from Douglas Adams, it's mostly harmless. At least in a legalistic standpoint. And then the higher end Satanists, the ones that actually truly deep down believe they are gods, instead of just mostly using the whole thing as a way to shock, using the Satanist angle to shock people, are usually fairly individualistic. They don't get into groups to do this. They work alone, or with a small or within a smaller group. Some of them do actually wind up becoming semi-cult leaders, but for the most part, the main group you see within Satanism or within the types of Satanism that engage in cultish behavior are teenage Satanists, and other actual devil worshippers. Does it happen? It absolutely does. If you get online and you look it up, you can find a number of murders that have happened in the name of Satan. You're most often committed by teenagers. Most often the teenagers didn't spend years reading occult books. They watched heavy metal music videos and decided that they're going to base their religion on that. Which is certainly not to say heavy metal is inherently evil or satanic. It's just, if you're an impressionable kid and you're trying to form a Satanism, and you have this group that's claiming to be Satan, that's claiming to venerate Satan, and talks about Satan's lyrics, it's probably where you're going to get your ideas. Most of this type of Satanism is a teenager thing. You get more often you wind up with the sacrificing of animals. Occasionally, you're gonna get more serious violent activity where they commit murder. But again, and here's a critical thing I think that's important to say about satanic cults. There's this particularly in the 80s, there was this impression of a widespread national, if not global, network of devil worshippers that were engaged in criminal activity. You particularly see this in what's known as the Satanic Panic, in which there was a widespread belief that satanic cults throughout the United States had infiltrated a number of daycares and were ritually sexually abusing children. There's a huge series of criminal cases that were brought against various daycares, most prominently the McMartin preschool trial, and dozens more, in which supposedly the members of these preschools the people running the preschools were satanic cults abusing children. There's a number of books, Michelle Speaks, the Satanic Underground, Satan Cellar, all that came out in the 70s, 80s, all suggesting this mass of satanic cults, and it's all bullshit. It didn't happen. In all of the many cases of claimed satanic ritual abuse, it was eventually discovered the kids were never abused. What most often happened, is the reliance on hypnosis as a way of gathering information. And with no disrespect to hypnosis, because it does have legitimate psychiatric uses, it's not a reliable way of gathering accurate testimony. It's actually a very good way of creating false memories. There's a very serious problem that continues here, and you see it even today in other groups. Because there are also, for that matter, people today that still insist that the satanic ritual abuse scare was entirely legitimate and really happened. They insist that even the McMartin case, where many of the people of the witnesses have since admitted that they made the whole thing up. In reality, in the McMartin case, let me check it, which 1980s, members of the McMartin family operated a preschool in California that was charged with numerous acts of sexual abuse of the children in their care. Accusations were made in 1983 Arrests and pretrial investigation ran from 1984 to 1987, and then the trial was 1987 to 1990. 6 years of criminal trials and no convictions. All of the charges were in fact dropped in 1990, making it the longest running and most expensive criminal trial in American history. It was a part of a huge satanic moral panic. They were terrified that there was this widespread network of sexual abuse, and it didn't happen. Oh, good heaven. So hopefully the stream is back. So what's happening here is two things. One is the misuse of hypnosis, because there was this now discredited belief that under hypnosis people's memories were improved, and therefore their testimony was trustworthy, because they couldn't, supposedly, in fact, according to some proponents at the time, you couldn't lie under hypnosis. We know now, and actually we had a pretty good idea then, that's not true. Hypnosis, basically, we don't entirely understand it, but it creates a highly relaxed state in the brain. On a neurological level, is very similar to listening to relaxing music. But the critical point is it actually makes a person very suggestible. If someone asks a very open-ended, leading question, or not open-ending, but asks leading questions, they can unintentionally create a memory of something that never happened. And this isn't just true of hypnosis. Police officers, if they're careless, can get people to confess to something they never did just by badgering them long enough and asking the right questions. And this impression that people typically have that they should listen to police officers and do what they tell, and eventually you can actually get some with everyone trying to be honest and trying to do the right thing. You can get somebody to say something that didn't happen, even without hypnosis. Put somebody into this suggestive state, continue this questioning long enough, feed them the right amount of information, and you can get them believing something happened that never happened. Which is what happened in the McMartin case. It's what happened in another case. In many other cases, this is why the alleged victims often wind up recanting. This is why no convictions were ever successfully brought in the McMartin case. It's also why, at this point, hypnosis is not admissible in court. Okay, just checking. Yeah. Is a good example for, and the other thing, they relied on unreliable testimony. And here's the thing: there are actually a few instances. It's not common, but there have been a number of instances where people have practiced sexual abuse, ostensibly with satanic trappings. The problems being, one, the idea was so widespread at the time and has become so widespread since. It was probably more accurate to say that a lot of these people were aping the popular idea instead of that they were actually worshiping the devil. The other side of it being that a lot of these people also, knowing that the idea was so widespread, especially once the idea had become so discredited, started incorporating these aspects to discredit the kid, so that if the kid went to the cops, or the cops are going to be less inclined to believe him because he's saying all this stuff that happened in the McMartin case or this other case, and since it was proven that wasn't true, the cops are going to, and the prosecutors are going to be less likely to pursue what the kid's telling them, just because they don't want to look stupid again. But they want to look stupid like these other people did. It's the sick reality of the mindset of people who do this. On the other hand, again, there are groups that have considered themselves satanic or otherwise occult that do practice criminal activities. The most famous of which, in recent memory, was the so-called vampire cult that happened in Florida. Trying to get information, just because I remember general details, I don't remember enough of the specific. But these people actually committed violent criminal acts. There we go, Rod Ferrell. It was a group of teenagers known as Vampire Clan. It was definitely a cult group who committed. They wound up murdering the parents of one of the members, and claiming that they were vampires and that by drinking blood they would be able to live forever. They were wrapped up supposedly in a role-playing game called Vampire the Masquerade. And again, there's all these outlandish claims. The role-playing game certainly didn't turn them into vicious killers. That's a common misconception. There is some truth that people with psychiatric problems who get into role-playing games can fuel their psychiatric problems. It can actually in that kind of mindset cause psychotic breaks. But it's the reality of somebody who had a problem to begin with. It isn't the role-playing game. It's the role-playing game may be a trigger. It's not the cause. Usually, particularly, you get it gets some because of the nature of the situation, and sometimes even under cause trance states. Most likely, this is just the usual realities of a cult, where you have a charismatic leader who has power over people and then abuses that power. But the thing is, a lot of the cults that get into the occult and satanic groups mindsets are smaller scale, at least in my experience. Certainly, as we've just seen with Rod Ferrell, they do get in some of the various satanic groups, they do get into violent criminal activity, but you don't usually hear of a group of Satanists with thousands of members, except in urban legends and dubious criminal trials. The groups that you get more widespread are usually more religious in nature and frequently consider themselves or claim to be Christian or have Christian or their leader is in some way a reincarnation of Jesus Christ. The most obvious examples being Jonestown, Shikiro, and the Branch Davidians. So, because Jonestown is the big obvious one that we're going to get to, I'm going to be a tease and talk about a different cult first, which would be Shinrinko. Shinrinko was a Japanese cult. Actually, it still is a Japanese group. It's since split into two groups, Aleph and Hikari Noa. I apologize for anyone out there who speaks Japanese. I obviously don't, so if I'm butchering pronunciations, blame it on the fact I don't speak Japanese. So, Shinrinko was a cult started by, what's the guy's name? Shoko Ashara started this group. And there's actually the one satanic element cult that I'll get back to that actually was fairly widespread. But he claimed to be Jesus Christ, he claimed to be Buddha, he claimed to be a number of religious leaders. Apparently Shiva, among the Hindu god, which makes for a very strange combination, just knowing those deities. But it was doomsday cult. He believed the end of the world was coming, so he orchestrated a series of terrorist attacks. The most famous of which was, of course, the sarin gas attack on Tokyo, in which the nerve gas, sarin gas, was released into the Tokyo subway system, injuring many people and killing several. There were additional attacks. There was attempts to actually to spread sarin gas into the United States. That didn't work, as I understand it, largely because the delivery system was an attempt to use trucks to spread it outdoors. And the reason as I understand it, the reason that sarin gas attack in Tokyo was so effective is it was a small, tight area, enclosed area, which means that all of that gas is sitting there. It's sitting there. It's not right. And it has a lot of people densely packed into effect. That's kind of ideal conditions to hit somebody with a gas attack, as opposed to trying to release it out in the street where people can get away from the cloud. Gas is very severe, but some types of gas, if you can get away from it quickly enough, or if you're far away, and not to mention it's going to get blown away by the wind. It doesn't work as well unless you have those ideal conditions, and even then, it injured far more people than it actually killed. Let me see. Just as a point of reference, the subway attack we're talking about was 1995. March 20th, 1995 to be precise. And just to give you an idea, it killed 12 people and injured 50. And underground, enclosed environment, densely packed, because this was during rush hour. It was very close to the ideal place and time and way to execute the attack. It wouldn't have worked as well in other circumstances. And it isn't although it, again, wasn't the only attack. There was other attempts to use chemical and biological agents on the United States. It was organized attempt. Hold on, just getting a little more information. I did mean to try to do this research in advance, but I didn't get a chance. Here we go. Shoko Ashara was put on trial with 27 murder counts and 13 different indictments, with the prosecution arguing he gave orders to attack the subway in order to overthrow the government to install himself as the Emperor of Japan. According to this, he was eventually sentenced to die by execution in June 2012. That was postponed due to the arrest of several fugitive members of the cult. The cult does still exist. It's tried very hard to divorce itself from Shoko Ashara, becoming Aleph and the other group. And notably, it's still been heavily monitored by the Japanese and other governments to make sure that they don't do anything like this again. So this is a really good example of what a cult can, what a destructive cult can do. And again, this fits a lot of what we've been talking about. This guy claimed to be Jesus Christ. He claimed to have this special knowledge. He claimed to know when the end of the world was coming. He got these followers to center around him and to believe these things. And, if you think your leader's God, it's hard, you don't really question what he tells you to do, even if it's something horrible. because he's God. I'm sorry, God. I won't. Even though I believe you're all knowing, all loving, and all benevolent, I won't do this thing you tell me to do because it sounds bad. Which is one of the which is a larger danger in the situation. But the thing to realize as well, and now it's finally time to talk about Jonestown. Jonestown is the single greatest loss of American life prior to 9/11. It was an absolute tragedy. It happened in 1978. Specifically, the mass suicide that this all culminates in was November 18th, 1978. The leader was a guy by the name of Jim Jones, hence Jonestown, if that wasn't extremely obvious. Now, the thing to realize about Jonestown, and Jim Jones in particular, and it's important to realize, is people tend to think about people, there's this impression that people who join these cults are gullible, or less intelligent, or otherwise inferior, and normal people won't fall for that. It's a nice thought. It's not true. Studies of cults and their followers tend to suggest that many cult members are actually higher than average intelligence. Usually cults specifically are preying on vulnerable people. That somebody moves to a new city, doesn't have any friends. Oh, well, come join us. Come to our house. We're having a nice meeting. You can, and it's presented as something positive. And usually when you first get involved, it isn't getting into violent activity. It isn't going, you don't show up to your first meeting for a cult with any degree of success and have the cult tell you, okay, you need to go shoot somebody. Or, okay, you need to drink this poison. Nobody's going to do that. They usually are offering you a lot of things you want. Friendship, companionship, sex in some cases. And it's getting you wrapped up in it. And the other thing to realize about Jim Jones that makes it significant is when he started out, he was actually pretty popular. In 1960, the mayor of Indianapolis, Charles Boswell, would appoint him the director of the Human Rights Commission. He adopted children of a number of ethnic backgrounds other than his own, calling them his rainbow family. He stated that integration is a more personal thing with me now. It's a question of my son's future. He portrayed the entire temple as a rainbow family. He adopted Korean American children. He adopted all of these children of various ethnicities. He fought for integration. He fought for equal rights. When he first started out, he wasn't this cackling supervillain that we'd like to think he was. He was a dedicated defender of civil rights and a defender of integration. He did all things that were good, things that people want, that people today agree with. That's how, this is what allows him to bring people in. It's not that he's just going, he's not going, moo-ha-ha-ha-ha. And it's a good example of a point. And this is not a political show. I am using this to illustrate a common misconception. People tend to think of cults as right-wing. There are plenty of right-wing cults. That's certainly true. But that's not exclusively the case. Jim Jones was very left. The mayor that appointed him the head of this, director of the Human Rights Commission was a Democrat. He was an outspoken supporter of the communists. These are not right-wing positions. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not saying that being on the left makes you more more inclined to be in a cult. There are plenty of right-wing cults. My point is, there are left-wing cults too. There are just about everything you think is universally true is not necessarily. Melinda pointed out another example of a left-wing cult would be the Symbionese Liberation Army, who kidnapped Patty Hearst. Not exactly a cult, but related. Again, people tend to think of this as a religious thing. They also tend to think of particularly terrorism, which can often relate as religious. But there's a group called the Tamil Tigers, which is it's ideologically driven, but they're outspoken atheists and communists, and it's a very active political cult in parts of Southeast Asia. As Melinda's saying, it's not a religious cult, political cult. Not all cults are religious in nature. Some of them are political, and the two overlap considerably. You don't need, and it's an interesting question that some scholars of religion will raise: can politics itself merge into becoming semi-religious? In case in point, I've seen people argue that communism itself, in many ways, fills the definitions of a religion, because they have an ideology they follow very passionately, even though they actively reject the idea of God. But again, now we're getting deeply mired into philosophy and questions of what does and does not make something a religion or a cult, and differences therein. And wow, are we getting off topic when we're talking about Jonestown? So Jim Jones eventually becomes convinced that a nuclear war is coming. He's convinced the United States is going to come under nuclear attack, and in that particularly Brazil is going to be a safe area. He would go down to Brazil to Belo Horizonte. I also don't speak Portuguese, or actually pretty much I don't speak anything other than English. With his family to set up with the idea of setting up a new temple location. On his way, he'd make his first trip to Guyana, which at the time was still a British colony. Guyana is where ultimately the cult compound would be set up. He eventually became so convinced that this attack was coming, he was so afraid that the government was out. He had this idea that he was going to be persecuted by the government, and he fled and started his own compound in California, or in Guyana, which is what eventually would become known as Jonestown. From reports from the handful of survivors, people who were able to get away, as time went on, he became more and more paranoid, requiring people to attend meetings that would run nearly all day, his guards tightly monitoring the situation, ruthlessly punishing anyone who tried to escape. I highly recommend trying to pick up a copy of Robert Snow's book, because he actually has a bunch of interviews and things like that with surviving cult members of various cults he talks about. Melinda points out Guyana was preferable because they spoke English. But he started this compound. He got people to move down there. He continued to preach. And he started what they called white drills. White drills where people would all be required to gather in the central square to listen to extended, what's what I'm looking for? Proselytizing by Jones, and then eventually would be required to drink flavor aid, which they were told was laced with cyanide. This was, generally speaking, considered a practice for the main event, because he felt the U.S. government was coming to get him, and was coming to get his followers, and he didn't want to be taken. So they were practicing to commit mass suicide, as insane as that sounds. Of course, they were also cut off from contact with their family back in the United States, until finally, quite frankly, an American hero who gets overlooked entirely too much, but a congressman by the name of Leo Ryan decided to go to Jonestown to investigate the allegations of human rights violations. He brought a number of relatives of the members of the temple. He brought a camera crew from NBC and reporters from various newspapers. They arrived on November 15th. 2 days later, they would go by airport to Port Kituma, and then from there they would be transported to Jonestown on a dump truck. Jones would have a big reception for the delegation that evening in the Central Pavilion. They were showed around. They were given a dog and pony show of how great everything really was. Eventually, they would choose to leave. Yes, there was also an alarm that someone was attacking and the guards shooting into the jungle. The reality is Ryan would eventually leave, taking a number of members of the cult who had asked to be able to leave with him, which was the final breaking point for Jones. Jones ordered his guards to go to the airstrip as Ryan's delegation was boarding, and they shot him down. They killed Congressman Ryan and 4 others near a Guyana Airways Twin Otter aircraft. One of the supposed defectors, Larry Layden, would draw a weapon, firing on members of the party that are already boarding the small Cessna. NBC cameraman was able to get footage of the first few seconds of the shooting at the Otter. The 5 were killed at the airstrip, which would be Congressman Leo Ryan, Don Harris, a reporter for NBC, Bob Brown, a cameraman for NBC, San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson, and Temple member Patricia Parks. Surviving the attacks were future Congressman Jackie Spear, then a staff member of Ryan's, Richard Dwyer, the deputy chief of mission from the U.S. Embassy at Georgetown, Bob Flick, a producer for NBC, Stephen Stung, NBC sound engineer, Tim Reiterman, San Francisco Examiner reporter, Ron Javers, San Francisco Chronicle reporter, and Charles Krause, who was a Washington Post reporter, and several defecting temple members. Later that day, sadly speaking, Jones gathered his followers at the Central Pavilion, gave a long speech, and ordered them to drink what was, in fact, this time, cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. Give me a moment. The actual audio, because it was recorded, the actual audio recordings of the final speech before, up to and including are available online from the FBI. I'm going to read from the transcripts, just to give a bit of an insight. Just deciding where, because it's actually fairly long. I'm not going to read the entire thing. If I hadn't been doing the show live at this point, I actually probably would have played. Melinda shares that mission was formed by former People's Temple members. They were trying to fight Jonestown. To quote the last words of Jim Jones, after this on the tapes, you just have music playing in silence. Something unintelligible take our life from us. We lay it down. We got tired. We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the condition of an inhumane world. I want to just take a moment. 909 inhabitants of Jonestown would die of cyanide poisoning. 304 of them were children. Like I said, this was the single greatest loss of American civilian life prior to September 11th. The entire recording is 45 minutes in length. These people died. I mean, they committed suicide based on Jim Jones's teachings. A few of them were shot because they didn't want to drink. I'm trying to get the exact totals on death toll. But a few of them basically didn't want to drink the Kool-Aid and were shot by his guards. Most of them willingly drank what they had been told was poison. Jones himself didn't drink the cyanide. That's not how he died. He was found with a gunshot wound to the head. The Guyanese coroner Cyril Moto stated that it was consistent with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Although his Jones's son Stephen believes his father may have did somebody else to shoot him. Interestingly enough, his autopsy showed high levels of the barbiturate phenobarbital. Quite possibly, in fact, enough that it would have been lethal in its own right, unless the person in question had built up a tolerance. I have a lot of fun. I make some jokes. This show is mostly supposed to be something to enjoy. There's nothing funny about this many people committing suicide for any reason. I've listened to the final tape, the one 918 people died. 909 of which willingly drank poisoned flavor aid. Oh, how maybe not all of them willingly, just given the fact that the ones who tried to get away, the ones who refused to drink were shot. And again, this wasn't. It's so easy to think of Jones as this cackling monster, but it's wrong. He didn't present himself as a supervillain. He didn't have horns and smoke coming from his mouth. He didn't have a forked tongue. He came across as a man of God. He came across as a prophet. He came across as a good guy who fought segregation. He fought for civil rights. He fought for things that we as Americans now hold dear. And he went so far off the reservation, directly caused the death of 918 people. If you're listening to this and aren't disturbed by that fact, I don't know what to tell you. This is an example of why, the majority of groups out there that get labeled cults are harmless. They're quirky, they're weird. They shouldn't be demonized. Particularly because there are groups that are dangerous, and we need to be paying attention to those. And particularly, we need to be paying attention when these groups start encouraging their members to cut off contact from the rest of their family. Jones eventually got his followers to move to Guyana. Koresh loaded them up in a compound in Waco, Texas. Heaven's Gate cult all got together, cut off ties. I am a religious person. I am by no means telling anyone that religion is wrong, bad, or in any other way evil. But you need to use your brain. You need to pay attention to what the people you are following are saying. You need to pay attention to who you people you care about are getting involved with. Jones was by far the worst single case of mass suicide by a cult in U.S. history. He's not the only example. We could debate what happened with Koresh, and I'm getting there. But there's also the Heaven's Gate cult, which was more UFO based. They thought that a UFO was following the Hale-Bopp comet, and that by committing suicide, they were all going to go up on the UFO and be taken to paradise. But again, it started out, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, the leaders, got together over an interest in theosophy and biblical prophecy. They became friends. And they get other people to follow them. They don't, you have to wonder sometimes when you read about some of these cults and you read from survivors of some of these cults, what goes through the minds of these followers and how many of them start out as seeming like reasonable human beings. There's an article on the website Cracked. Cracked is, of course, primarily a humor website, but it actually does a number of interviews with people who have real-life experiences, including interviews with a survivor of a group that turned into a cult, who talks about how it started out as Bible study and giving one person too much power and too much authority and too much attention, and eventually crossing the line from religious leader into cult leader. It's a thin line. It's a dangerous line. But it's when people cross. I'm sorry. I know I'm kind of floundering here a little. It's less that I don't know what to say as the enormity of what we're talking about. I study demons for a living. Not for a living. I don't get paid, but this is what I do. If you go all the way back to the very first episode, and we're at episode 41, so this is a year and 40 episodes ago. When I first defined demonology, I use a definition Lou Gentili, my mentor, used, that I still think is valid and legitimate. Demonology is the study of evil. There's a reason people out there, and I know at least one of the people in the chat included, want to do what I do. It's not pretty. I'd rather not spend. There are plenty of days I'd rather not spend my time researching these people and these cults and serial killers and violent criminal behavior. I mean, like most people listening, this stuff makes me want to puke. When I think, the Heaven's Gate cult, 1997, March 26, 1927, the cops found 39 members had committed mass suicide because they thought this spacecraft was coming to take them away. And, you can find the videos, you can find the website still up, and you listen to Applewhite talk, and it sounds silly, and it sounds crazy, and it'd be something to laugh at if 39 people hadn't committed suicide over it. Because it was the only way to evacuate the Earth, apparently. And there are groups like that still active, that are active today. I mean, I can't list any of them because I don't know off the top of my head which ones are about to cross that line. But there are, the reality is there are groups out there that are committing violent criminal acts in the name of God. There are various terrorist groups. There are various that many terrorist groups certainly can act like a cult, and a number of terrorist acts are definitely have been the work of cults. Case in part at Shinrinko, and all of the people that it killed. It fits the definitions of a terrorist act, and the group is definitely a cult. Okay, I need to take a break from talking about death, doom, and gloom. I'm not ending the episode. So what I'm going to do, and I'm not switching topics for that matter, as tempting as it is, believe me. But what I am going to do is talk a little bit about the more positive side of this, which is what you can do, what you can look for. In general, my advice, if you're worried about the group you're a member of, ask questions. Actually, if you're not worried about the group that you're a member of, ask questions anyway. A good, legitimate spiritual leader should encourage honest questions. I don't care if they're Buddhist, Christian, Taoist, Muslim, or Pastafarian. If they berate you and put you down for asking questions and for trying to understand what you're being told, there's something wrong. Does it mean they're going to wind up telling everybody to commit mass suicide? Probably not. But something needs to be... Something is, if they're shutting down honest inquiry, something's wrong. And, lots of legitimate groups aren't doing that. I mean, also be really careful of any group. The more focus and let's put on an individual leader, the more I think the more dangerous things get. In a religion that's operating healthy, you may have you should have great respect for the person running it. And Melinda says, I know of some cults that don't involve death. And yeah, again, there are lots of cults out there that don't involve death, that don't involve criminal activity. There are groups that can be defined as, that fit many of the definitions of cult that don't even require you to give them all of your money. But again, if it's a group of weird people that want to all go live together in a commune situation that aren't doing anything violent or dangerous or psychologically damaging or abusive, they don't really have a place in this discussion. This is a show about demonology. It's not a show about weird religious movements. There are plenty of people out there that are part of weird fringe religious groups, some of which venerate powerful religious leaders, powerful leaders that are seen as divine or semi-divine, that will never commit the sort of violent acts we're talking about. That will never even get into the psychological abuse that these cults can get into. I'm not concerned about those people. I'm not saying there isn't reason to be concerned, because it's not that hard to cross that line. But specifically, the point of, as I said way back at the beginning of this episode, my concern is groups that are engaged in criminal activity, specifically because I don't want to. I'm making a deliberate point of trying not to demonize fringe religious movements. Every religious movement was fringe at some point. Christianity, my own faith, was very single religious group leader who is seen as God. People got up and followed him, gave up their worldly possessions. Melinda's saying that Unification Church was a group that didn't commit violent acts, that was a cult, but now is more of a fringe religion. Seventh-day Adventists started that way. It's now actually pretty much seen as a mainstream denomination, not even a fringe. Christianity itself, to a large degree, was originally a messianic cult within Judaism, and they weren't the only ones at the time. Judaism at one point was a religion of a bunch of workers, whether they be slaves or not, within the Egyptian civilization. Buddhism was originally a radical idea that this member of the Brahmin caste of India had, of why they shouldn't be doing, that completely rewrote everything people believed about the world. And so the caste system was wrong. Religion in general tends to start like this. You have somebody who has a radical idea. It shakes everything up. They gather followers, and more followers, and more followers, and it keeps going, and you add a couple centuries, and eventually you start getting a widely accepted, recognized religion instead of a crazy fringe cult. But if you go back, to further illustrate my point, I'm picking on my own religion because it's a good example. If you go back to first century accounts from Romans and Jews of the Christians, Christians were seen as cannibals. Christians were seen as practitioners of black magic. They were seen as committing murders. They did all of these were thought to have done all of these horrible things. Some of which were based on misunderstandings of Christian doctrine. Particularly at the time Christian, and now more specifically Catholic, you have this idea of eating the Eucharist, and the Eucharist is the body of Christ. They're eating somebody's dead body. That's cannibalism. It's not, actually, when you get into the deeper theology, but when all you're being told is you have this group of religious people that are eating human flesh, that doesn't sound healthy. When you have this group that's meeting in secret, meeting under the city, in frickin' crypts and catacombs. Granted, they're doing that because they're hiding from the Romans, who at various points in their history were actively trying to kill them all. But still, it doesn't sound, if you invented Christianity today, people would probably see it as a cult. If you invented Judaism today, people would see it as a cult. It is very much a question of perception. And it's why when you look at all of these groups that are now seen as cults, some of them are problematic, some of them, Heaven's Gate still exists, Psalm Shrinko still exists, under new names, at least in the case of Shrinko. Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints certainly still exist despite numerous criminal cases. But you have these groups that still exist that are in fact the threat. But you have hundreds of other fringe religious groups out there that will never commit a violent act. There's a great quote, to get biblical again, but it applies. And I think it's good advice across the board, not just with cults. Which is Matthew 7:16. And it's particularly apropos because it's talking about false teachers and false prophets. "Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles?" Or from Matthew 7:20, so then by their fruit shall you recognize them. Proverbs 20:11, it is by his deeds that a lad distinguishes himself, if his conduct is pure and right. If you want to know if somebody, look at what it's doing. Look at what it's telling people to do. Groups that are telling people to give their money to the poor, as opposed to give all their money to the cult leader. Groups that encourage, and certainly I'm not saying don't donate to churches. I mean, churches keep going by donation as a rule, but how much are they asking for? What do they promise in return? A group that's saying, okay, we need to put a new roof on this building because the old one's literally about to collapse. And it actually is obviously literally about to collapse. They're one thing. You want another example that isn't generally seen as a cult, but certainly can operate like one? How about televangelists who desperately need money that's supposedly going to some poor country in Africa, and meanwhile the cult leader or televangelist is buying his 5th Rolls Royce? What are they doing with the money they're given? Are they feeding the sick? Are they helping the poor? Are they helping the destitute? Or are they buying themselves new fancy toys? There are lots of groups out there, some of which are very mainstream. I think there's some truth in saying that there are, and I'm not going to get into naming names because some of them are still active, and then you get into lovely aspects of litigation and lawsuits and slander, libel, and other things I don't want to do. I have no desire to spend my time in court defending myself from these charges, nor do I think anyone will not understand that. But there are definitely televangelists out there. Apparently, Tonight with John Oliver last week did a great segment on televangelists. I haven't seen it. That's Melinda speaking. I happen to like what I've seen of John Oliver, I'll certainly say. I don't want to go beyond that because I don't want to get... avoid being political is one of my... I'm already dealing with religion, which is one of the most taboo subjects on the planet. I don't need to get into politics as well. Especially because for the most part I really, really, really hate politics. I'll save the current election. I think both candidates are complete idiots and leave it at that. This may be the first point where I think voting Cthulhu because he's is actually the lesser evil. But there are these televangelists that ask for lots of money for dubious reasons, and particularly a lot of them claim to have supernatural powers Um, they claim to get word of knowledge. They claim to be able to heal the sick. I like how the Roman Catholic Church handles claims of miracle. They're really, really, to be a Catholic and claim to have magical healing power is one thing. For the Catholic Church to endorse you as having this power is quite another. Before the Catholic Church will even consider it, you need batteries of medical documentation saying, yeah, this person had this disease, doesn't have it anymore, and there's no medical reason why the disease just, poof, disappeared. Lourdes is the perfect example at this point. There are, it's this holy spring in France, I want to say, that supposedly, people have miraculous healings at. The Catholic Church acknowledges some of those healings, not all of them, not even most of them. And there's a whole team set up at Lourdes by the Catholic Church with the job of deciding which miracles are real and which miracles aren't. Whereas some of these people will sit on television and say, and if you've ever watched them, you'll know who I'm talking about. I'm getting a word of knowledge that someone in my audience is having heart trouble, and God is miraculously healing that. Okay. Given the popularity of your show and the fact there are thousands, if not millions, of people watching you, and given the prevalence of heart problems in the United States, somebody's going to fit. Someone out there is going to be having heart problems when you describe them. Or if not live, the moment it goes on air, the first time it goes on air, somebody down the road is going to see it in reruns and be having heart problems at the time, and go, he means me. And you get one person who goes into spontaneous remission, and people do that sometimes. Spontaneous remission being the medical term for bleeped if we know what happened. Then now all of a sudden you have a guest who was miraculously healed on your show to have on your show, but it's not verifiable. You don't even know that you played a statistical lot. Given a large enough sample size, that's not hard. There are groups that use even less subtle ways. Usually less often with the big televangelists, but tent revivals. You get Peter, the one guy who got remarkably accurate words of knowledge. He'd call out people in the audience, know their doctor, know where they lived, know exactly what was wrong with them, and tell them God had given them all this information and he was going to miraculously heal them. And what had actually happened is, before the show, everybody filled out prayer cards with their name, where they're from, their doctor's name, what illnesses they have. These cards were gathered up by volunteers, given to his wife. His wife would sit backstage with a radio transmitter and transmit the information right into his ear. And because this has been widely exposed, I'm going to look up his name. I'm 90% sure I remember who it is, but I want to be accurate. Peter Popoff is the one I'm talking about. His wife broadcast information into his ear, so he could claim to get it from God. It's worth noting here, I have a lot of issues with professional skeptic James Randi, aka the Amazing Randy. He is the one, in fact, who exposed Popoff, ironically enough, by essentially hacking the radio transmission and listening in. Along with a bunch of other funny things, like having one of Randy's accomplices, who was a guy, dress up as a woman, who Popoff would heal of uterine cancer. Um, also, Elizabeth Popoff, the wife, using racial slurs over the radio, describing an African American audience member telling her husband to keep her hands off her tits. I'm watching you. Hearing her laughing at the physical appearance of someone in terminal stage testicular cancer. There's a whole series of these people that use various tricks of stage magicians. Psychic surgery being a very popular example. Another one being leg shortening or lengthening. And it's not. These aren't necessarily people that are going to go start a doomsday cult and tell their followers to kill themselves, but they are gathering huge sums of money from people. My personal 2 bits. If you've got some extra money lying around and you want to do something with that money for God, my advice: find a charity that you believe in and donate it to that. If you have a local church, small local church that actually could use the money, and there's certainly plenty of legitimate churches out there that, if you're a small backwoods church with 12 congregants in a house, in a building just shy of being condemned, you could probably use the money. If you're a mega church, you don't really need the money. But if all else fails, there's a lot. Cancer research, AIDS research, any one of 100 of other, various charities that help starving children around the world. The Red Cross. There are lots of legitimate places to give your money instead of these religious leaders, and God will be much happier with you giving your money. And I'm certainly not a prophet, and I don't claim to speak from God, but I think I say with complete certainty that God will be much happier if you give your money to a homeless guy on the street who's just trying to get something in his stomach for the day than if you give it to someone who is going to go buy another Rolls Royce. Melinda's giving advice about a particular group that funding a Danish cult leader called Planet Aid. I would also recommend, certainly, I'm not familiar with Planet Aid, so if that's, but Melinda's a pretty reliable source. I know her well, so I would trust what she's saying, that basically the money is going to a rich Danish cult leader, the cult being called Tvind, Tvind. I would definitely recommend, if you're going to donate to a charitable organization, and it isn't a big obvious one, if you're going to donate to UNICEF, or you're going to donate to the Red Cross or Doctors Without Borders, you can be pretty confident it's going to go where it needs to go. There are lots of other cults. There are lots of other legitimate charitable organizations out there. I can't begin to list half of them. But do your, if it isn't one that's instantly recognizable, even if it is, because there are a few that are very well known that are much shadier than you think, and I do not want, it goes too close to politics to get into it. But do your homework, know who you're giving the money to, know what they're going to do with it. Circuit Man points out that the Red Cross is, of course, run by vampires. We all know this. Although, funny enough thing I would point out, blood drives are a really good thing. I definitely recommend giving blood. More significantly, I recommend giving blood when it isn't a disaster. Because every time there's a big disaster, everybody runs out and gives blood. That isn't entirely a bad thing. But the problem is, they only need so much blood. And something has to be done with the rest of it. And the reality is, blood doesn't last forever. It has a shelf life, even with proper refrigeration. After months, year, I think 6 months, maybe a little longer, it's the blood that you donated is no good. So that guy who just had, got stabbed half a dozen times, who desperately needs your rare blood type, well, you donated during the tragedy 3 years ago. Oh, he's now got a serious problem. So donate blood. Donate it now. Donate it when you can donate it. Don't wait for some massive. Don't just wait for some massive tragedy. There is a TV show that I'm fond of that I would also generally recommend that touches on a lot of this very well, called Adam Ruins Everything. One of the first episodes, if not the first, was Adam Ruins Giving, that talks about a lot of what we're talking about here, that a lot of what you think is charity, is great charities, doesn't work as well as you think they do, and do your home. Again, my point here being, do your homework. Think about who you're giving it to and what they're going to use it for. I'm not saying don't give it to religious people. I'm not saying give it to religious people. I'm just saying be informed. And the reality is that to put things in a more positive spin, there are religious groups that do great things. They collect money for good things. The Catholic Church, for all the flack it gets, deserved and otherwise, runs a lot of charities. A really good example being their various missionary work around the world. And they're bringing food and medicine and education to impoverished countries that need it. For all the shit they get as well, for that matter, for as much as people put them in the category of a cult and even a destructive cult, the more mainstream Mormon Church does an enormous, fantastic amount of charitable work. People think, people talk about how in Mormonism you're supposed to tithe 10% of your income to the church. That's true. You actually read the Bible, in mainstream Christianity you're supposed to do the same thing. People have this impression, though, you donate that 10% and it gets used to build more churches. Yeah, it does. They also provide wheelchairs to people who can't afford it. They provide clean water to places that desperately need it. They provide glasses to people that need it. They do a lot of other worthwhile things. There are church groups out there that are just taking your money to line the pockets of the people in charge. And there are ones that are actually using that money to do something worthwhile. I'm not endorsing, or I'm not trying to endorse or condemn any individual religious group. And dear crap, does this sound like the disclaimer at the end of a commercial? Just saying there are groups out there that are doing good things. It isn't, as much as it seems like the show isn't all doom and gloom. And it's worth, especially when we've gotten so dark tonight, I think it's worth talking about some of the good things that are going on in the world, some of the more positive things religious groups are doing. In fact, because I want to end on a more positive note, and even more positive note, not go as doom and gloom as I have been. The Satanic Temple, which we've talked about on the show before, which is gets into a lot of goofy activity. Most notably, I think they built the statue of Satan to go into the courthouse to go alongside the Ten Commandments. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Go for it. See, and it's fair to say I'm a great believer in the First Amendment. I'm a great believer that you're entitled to say whatever you want, even if I think you're stupid for saying it. So, as long, I think, keep the Ten Commandments in the courthouse, and and if somebody else wants to build a statue of Buddha or Krishna or the devil, let them do it too. What's good for one is good for the other. But aside from that, and my other personal favorite, which was turning The mother of Fred Phelps, the head of Westboro Baptist Church, down there, you want to talk about a cult, gay after her death by doing a ritual over the grave. They also do a lot of work with anti-bullying and with allowing kids to circumvent. There are some schools that have still allow corporal punishment. Well, you can get out of it in some cases if you have a religious prohibition against corporal punishment. A kid can just claim, "Oh, I'm a member of the Satanic Temple. It's against my religion," and avoid that. For a group that openly claims to be Satanists, so much like the Church of Satan, which they consider themselves a spiritual successor to, they don't actually worship the devil. They are doing some really good things. It is as realistically more a political movement than a religious one. And how many of you would expect a demonologist to say nice things about a satanic group, right? I do have to get to work soonish, and I think I've run the course pretty well here. If any of you haven't seen it yet, there is up the 1 year anniversary spectacular. I highly recommend you all go watch it. You can hear about how I became a demonologist, a little bit about my life story in case you're interested, or even if you're not. I want to thank everybody who's been with me. It's been a heck of a ride so far. We've got more to come. I'm working on new guests. Did it just turn off? Okay, it just shut off. But yeah, to reiterate, I'm working on new guests. I'm working on new topics. Not only are we not finished yet, we haven't even started. If you enjoyed this, feel free to like, comment. I do try to respond to comments. Subscribe if you want. If you have show ideas, if you have guest ideas, if you think you yourself might be an interesting guest, feel free to email me at kevinm.paranormalencyclopedia@gmail.com, or you can check out our website, paranormalencyclopedia.webs.com, or you can just leave something on Facebook and I'll get to it there. I will also say I am currently planning to do a late contest in honor of the fact that we reached 1 year. Probably I'll just hold off and do it when we hit in a couple of weeks when we hit the 50th episode, since we're nearly there. If anybody has any ideas on what to give you, what you might be interested in as a giveaway, let me know, because I'm sort of stumped at the moment, which is why I didn't do it on Friday. And you will, of course, be getting more Forgotten Fairy Tales. I haven't quite decided what my next story is going to be. I'm leaning possibly towards something from Mesoamerica, or maybe even North American, more modern folktale. But we'll find that out, and I'll probably record that Monday or Tuesday for you all. But for now, we're wrapping it up for the night. God bless everyone. Thanks for listening in, and thanks for helping me get to where we are. I'll see you next week.